Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our top stories. US President Donald Trump says a Gaza ceasefire deal is very close as Israel warns Hamas that they must sign the US proposal or be annihilated. Meanwhile, the last remaining operational hospital in the enclave has reportedly been evacuated as Israeli military action continues. Meanwhile, Israel says that they will prevent entry of Arab foreign ministers planning to hold a summit in Ramallah in the West Bank. A Saudi-led delegation are hoping to make a landmark visit as Israeli Defense Minister says we will build a Jewish-Israeli state in the West Bank. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has met with US senators pushing for pressure on Russia to agree to a ceasefire. Zelensky also questions Russia's commitment to progress in peace as Moscow confirms it is sending a team to Istanbul for talks set for June the 2nd. President Trump says he plans to double tariffs on imported steel and aluminium to 50%, increasing pressure on steel producers amid further global trade tensions. Trump says the move will even further secure the steel industry in the United States. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says that China wants to dominate and control Asia as he speaks at the Shangri-La Dialogue Defense Summit. Hegseth calls on Asian countries to boost military spending over what he calls an imminent threat from China. The US Supreme Court has allowed President Trump to end legal protection for 500,000 migrants. The decision exposes many migrants from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua and Venezuela to deportation. Billionaire Elon Musk has bid farewell to his special government role in a peculiar Oval Office press conference with President Trump. Musk, who was sporting a black eye, has spearheaded sweeping federal cuts as Trump hailed his incredible service. Heavy rain in central Nigeria has caused flooding which has so far killed at least 115 people. The Nigerian government has expressed its profound sorrow, with emergency agencies directed to assist in the search and rescue operation. We start this hour as tensions are running high in the Middle East as US President Donald Trump announced that a ceasefire and hostage release deal between Israel and Hamas may be very close. Speaking from the Oval Office, Trump said a possible agreement could be revealed within hours. This is what the US President said.
It's an update to the latest ceasefire agreement that Israel has agreed to, but Hamas still considering.
Well, they're very close to an agreement on Gaza, and we'll let you know about it during the day or maybe tomorrow, and we have a chance of that. And I think we have a chance of making a deal with Iran also. They don't want to be blown up. They would rather make a deal, and I think that could happen in the not-too-distant future. That would be a great thing if we could have a deal without bombs being dropped all over the Middle East. That would be a very good thing. They can't have a nuclear weapon.
The proposed plan, known as the Witkoff deal, includes a 60-day ceasefire, the release of 28 Israeli hostages alive and dead, and over 1,200 Palestinian prisoners released in exchange. But Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz has warned Hamas to accept the deal or face annihilation. Hamas says it is still reviewing the plan and consulting with other factions in Gaza. Meanwhile, a diplomatic rift is deepening between France and Israel. French President Emmanuel Macron accused Israel of jeopardizing Western credibility. Let's listen in.
If we abandon Gaza, if we consider there is a free path for Israel, even if we do condemn the terrorist attacks, we kill our own credibility in the rest of the world. And this is why we do reject double standards, and this is why I think it's very important in our current environment to be consistent and to follow our principles, our rules, and to consider that what is at stake is clearly the global order, and what is at stake is our credibility to protect this global order.
Well, Israel have responded, accusing Macron of waging a crusade against the Jewish state. Well, given all of these updates, there is a lot to discuss, and joining us to do so is Spencer Critchley, a communications strategist joining us from California. Spencer, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Let's first look at Donald Trump's comments. He says a hostage deal in exchange for prisoners and ceasefire is very close. He expects it potentially within hours. Do you believe that Trump's optimism is well placed, given the fact that Hamas have reportedly said this deal doesn't come close to their demands?
Well, I would love to hope so, but unfortunately history teaches us otherwise. Trump, of course, is a notorious liar. And furthermore, predicting something wonderful is about to happen in the near future is something he does weekly. Typically, it's 2 weeks from now, there's going to be, complete reform of the U.S. healthcare system or some such. Now he's saying there's essentially going to be peace in the Middle East in a few hours. Now, again, it would be wonderful news if that turns out to be true, but unfortunately, Trump has earned himself a place in the world, on the world stage, as someone who simply can't be trusted to say anything honest.
Yeah, Spencer, and moving away from Trump's comments, looking at US involvement in these negotiations, of course, this plan is being coined the Witkoff deal. US involvement has been consistent. How important do you think it is that the US remain involved in these discussions, not just for the wider peace, but also given the hostage situation as well?
Well, I think it's generally very important for the United States to be involved, again, to the extent that the United States can be a trusted partner in such negotiations. And I'm sorry to keep returning to the same subject, but it really is enormously important that the Trump administration has no credibility and their motivations can't be trusted. I mean, Trump just concluded a tour of part of the Middle East, which was essentially a corruption tour, shaking down 3 of the governments there for enormous contributions to him personally, as well as to members of his family and to Steve Witkoff's family. So traditionally, of course, it's been crucially important for the United States to be involved in the Middle East and elsewhere around the world as a guarantor of that post-World War II liberal democratic world order, which for all its failings has worked better than any other system in the history of civilization.
Yes, Spencer, Defence Minister Israel Katz has said that Hamas have to sign this deal or they face annihilation. How do you think that will be viewed on the global diplomatic stage if that happens?
I mean, really, it's Katz and Trump are like 2 peas in a pod there. And there's Trump threatening Iran with annihilation, essentially, and threatening to be dropping bombs all over the Middle East, while the Israeli defense minister is threatening to annihilate Hamas in Gaza. It's just incredibly counterproductive and dangerous, and furthermore stupid. The idea that the United States could somehow achieve any useful objective, set aside the morality at stake here, the idea that the United States could achieve any strategic objective by conducting massive bombing campaigns, surely we've moved beyond that. I mean, this is essentially the international strategy of a drunk in a bar.
Spencer, let's look now at some of the condemnation that Israel has been receiving amid some form of aid blockade, of course a full blockade in place around the enclave for across around 11 weeks. We've also, of course, as you've mentioned, seen bombing, displacement within Gaza. This rift between Israel and France has got worse in recent days. What's the significance of Western nations calling out Israel amidst what humanitarian groups say is famine and starvation on a huge scale?
Yes, well, this also mirrors the situation that I just referred to, where Trump and Israel, at least the Netanyahu administration, are sounding so similar and turning themselves into international pariahs. The strength of the United States and the strength of Israel, which is considerable and very impressive, of course, for such a small country, is ultimately based on its values. And once Israel or the United States abandons those values, they become just another brawler in a global war of all against all. To refer to history once again, we need only look at the history of Europe, which was torn by wars for century after century after century, until finally, after World War II, the Western world settled on a better way of relating to each other. And if we abandon the values that have made that post-war order possible, we go back to that situation, except on a global scale, of everybody thinking that they're going to somehow prevail by being even more aggressive and even more violent against the others. And of course, surely by now history has taught us that that is not only morally horrific, but simply does not work.
Yes, Spencer Critchley, thank you for that. You will be staying with us as we stay in the region, and Israel has blocked a historic visit by a group of Arab foreign ministers to the West Bank, a move that further strains diplomatic relations in the region. The delegation, led by Saudi Arabia and including diplomats from the UAE, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt and Jordan, was set to meet Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah. But Israeli officials denied entry, claiming the visit was a political move to promote the creation of a Palestinian state, something Defense Minister Israel Katz has publicly rejected. Katz issued a defiant statement from the West Bank, saying Israel would continue building a Jewish-Israeli state on the ground, while foreign leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron only recognise Palestine on paper. This comes after the Israeli government announced the approval of 22 new settlements in the occupied West Bank, a move widely condemned by the international community. We stay in the region again as Israeli airstrikes have hit targets in western Syria, killing at least one civilian, according to Syrian state media. The attack marks the first strike in nearly a month and comes shortly after Damascus announced indirect talks with Israel aimed at easing tensions. Israel's military says it targeted weapons storage facilities near Latakia, claiming the missiles stored there threatened international and Israeli shipping. State media reported the strike hit areas near the village of Zama, and additional strikes were carried out near Tartus. Israel says it will continue to act against perceived threats in the region, while the US has urged both sides to pursue a non-aggression agreement. Syria and Israel remain technically at war since 1948, with tensions persisting despite recent diplomatic efforts to ease hostilities. We move over to Europe now as US Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal have met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv as diplomatic efforts intensify ahead of expected direct peace talks. Graham announced that the US Senate will advance a bill next week to impose tougher sanctions on Russia and countries continuing to buy its oil and other goods. During their visit, both senators accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of stalling the peace process. Graham, who spoke with Donald Trump before the trip, said the US president expects concrete actions from Moscow. This comes as Trump called both Putin and Zelensky stubborn while trying to mediate an end to the war. Here is what the senators had to say.
But I don't believe Russia is interested in peace. As we speak, they're building up their forces along Ukraine's border for a counteroffensive in the summer or the fall. I'm going to Paris and I'm going to Germany after this trip. I'm going to urge our European allies to lower the price cap, to make it harder on Putin's fossil fuel economy, increase OPEC production, and lower the price cap. If Europe will do that, it will matter. It will hurt Russia's war machine. Ukraine is ready for peace, is willing to make sacrifices and compromise for peace, is willing to stop the fighting to achieve peace. It's clear to almost anyone Putin is not remotely interested in anything that would lead to peace.
The burden is on Vladimir Putin. And right now, let's be very blunt, he's playing the United States for a stooge. Americans don't like to be made fools of. but that's what he's doing. Clearly, obviously, prolonging and playing for time, stonewalling and stalling and stringing out the President of the United States. Americans won't stand for it.
Well, the second round of Russia-Ukraine peace talks is tentatively set for Monday in Turkey, but Kyiv has yet to confirm its participation, demanding to see Russia's formal proposals first. Graham has warned that Moscow may be using the talks as a charade. Meanwhile, Russia's ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, has said that Moscow is open to a ceasefire, but only if the West stops arming Ukraine and Kyiv halts troop mobilization. He added that a simple truce would not be enough to end the conflict. Heading to the Indo-Pacific now, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth issued a direct warning on China's military posturing in the region. Hegseth called out China, calling it a threat. He said Beijing's army is rehearsing for the real deal, pointing to China's military drills around Taiwan. This is what the US Defense Secretary said.
It has to be clear to all that Beijing is credibly preparing to potentially use military force to alter the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. We know, it's public, that Xi has ordered his military to be capable of invading Taiwan by 2027. The PLA is building the military needed to do it, training for it every day, and rehearsing for the region.
Hegseth also stressed that the US will not leave its allies alone in the region and promised a stronger defence presence, while urging partner nations to invest more in their own security. Reassuring US commitments, he said the future of America is intertwined with the region's security and prosperity. Let's have another listen.
America is proud to be back in the Indo-Pacific, and we're here to stay. The United States is an Indo-Pacific nation. We have been since the earliest days of our republic. We will continue to be an Indo-Pacific nation with Indo-Pacific interests for generations to come. And under President Trump's leadership, the United States is committed to achieving peace through strength. That starts with deterring aggression around the world and here in the Indo-Pacific, here in our priority theater, here with you, our allies.
Meanwhile, he emphasised the shift away from imposing ideology and instead building defence ties based on common sense and mutual interests. Hegseth warned that any Chinese attempt to forcefully take Taiwan would have devastating global consequences, reaffirming that the US does not seek war but will not be pushed out of the region. Well, joining us once again to discuss these comments and the ramifications of them is Spencer Critchley, communications strategist, joining us from California. Spencer, thank you for staying with us. Let's first look at Hegseth's comments. He's called out China here. He said China is a threat. Given the ongoing tensions between the US and China, why do you think Hegseth has chosen to use such strong language in Asia?
Well, it does seem to be of a piece with the Trump administration's addiction to bluster. It's hard to understand how this could be useful. Typically, when nations are strong and they have a problem with the behavior of another nation, they address these matters more privately than publicly, and it's part of their strength that they're able to do that. But beating your chest and essentially making threats, as we see President Trump doing so routinely, including in the Middle East right now, actually communicates weakness. And it really should be beneath the most powerful country in the history of the world to engage in this sort of chest thumping and boasting about our power. When you have power, you don't need to boast about it. It's clear to other people. And that power becomes far more credible if you're able to speak quietly and firmly and demonstrate that your word is worth something, and especially if it's backed up by principle instead of just raw self-interest. I noticed that Hegseth is lecturing the Indo-Pacific countries about the need to invest more in their own defense, which seems like a reasonable position, while he's assuring them that the United States will be there for them. But he's doing that by citing the example of Europe right after the Trump administration has essentially abandoned and betrayed Europe. And I don't think that that is lost on any of the leaders of the nations he's addressing.
Yes, Spencer, in the last 24 hours, China have reacted to reports that Trump is set to continue arms sales to Taiwan, with some reports stating that it could exceed the amount sold during Trump's first term. Now that we've had these comments from Hegseth alluding to Taiwan and a potential rehearsal for an invasion, as he's put it, how do we expect China to react to this comment?
Well, we've seen that China, especially under President Xi, does not react well at all to this kind of behavior and is quite ready to be equally belligerent in response. I think that Hegseth makes a fair point. Obviously, China is investing enormously in its military, and it has been staging all these exercises that do look quite threatening to Taiwan as well as its other neighbors, including Japan. But I often wonder if these folks are actually familiar with the practice of thinking about what happens next. So you make the threat, and then if you're thinking strategically, you have to sort of game out what would be likely to follow from this. And what tends to happen in response to these public threats is a return of a higher level of threat, and then you get a cycle of escalation. Unless you think that somehow it'd be great to go to war with China, that really does not seem like a fruitful way to address this. Again, it doesn't mean you have to be weak or to just roll over, but there are other forms of strength that are far more effective.
Yes, Spencer. I want to look to some comments he made around imposing an ideology, also saying that defence ties should be built on common sense and mutual interests. What do you think Hegseth means by this?
Well, this is the realist approach to international affairs. In the United States, Henry Kissinger is a famous example of that approach, where you just set aside questions of moral principle. In the United States case, it would be setting aside the promotion of democracy and human rights and focus on each country pursuing its own interests and trying to find areas of agreement. That's a respectable philosophy of international relations. I tend to think ultimately it's naive. I think that realism without ideals ends up leading towards that world of the eternal war of all against all, as Thomas Hobbes described it in Leviathan many years ago. But as I say, it's not an absurd philosophy. Many smart people who know much more about international relations than I do subscribe to the realist philosophy. But I think that announcing that you are no longer interested in talking about principles and pursuing solutions to climate change, for example, or to set aside America's longstanding commitment to human rights, I think just ends up weakening us, because ultimately we're thrown back again on just raw power. And as powerful as the United States is, there's no possibility of any country being powerful enough to succeed if it doesn't have allies who actually like and trust it.
Yes, Spencer, as we bring an end to this discussion, I know this conference and summit was defence related, but I feel like we should briefly touch on trade. Of course, we've seen Xi go on an East Asia tour. We've seen the ASEAN nations talk about unity in the face of US tariffs and trade uncertainties. Do you think that for Asian countries, given what Hegseth is continuing to say, the narrative that the US is pushing, do you think this is almost a pick one side or the other situation?
Yes, it does seem to be this, typically black and white thinking that belligerent people seem to be addicted to. The way that we've avoided major wars for the past few decades is by focusing more on trade, building an international system of peaceful negotiations. There's certainly been conflicts, some of them very violent, of course, but by world historical standards, this has been the most peaceful and prosperous period in the history of the world. So we do not need this sort of black and white thinking. China, while it's an economic competitor and a potential military threat, is also a leading trade partner for the United States and a great many other countries. So this is just a small indication of the true complexity of the situation. And I would hope we would have people working on behalf of the United States who are capable of thinking in a slightly more complex way.
Spencer Critchley, thank you ever so much for joining us and providing your insight on both of those topics. We will, of course, continue to look at the ongoing tensions in the Indo-Pacific. But we move on now, and US President Donald Trump announced that representatives from Pakistan will visit the United States next week to discuss trade deals, including tariffs. Pakistan faces a possible 29% tariff on exports to the US due to a $3 billion trade surplus. Trump also expressed his unwillingness to make deals with Pakistan or India if the two countries engage in war, following recent clashes between the nuclear-armed neighbours after the Pahalgam terror attack. India, which faces 26% tariffs on exports to the US, is also in trade talks with Washington, with an interim agreement expected by early July. Trump mentioned that India is close to finalising a deal and recently hosted Indian Trade Minister Piyush Goyal to advance the negotiations. Staying with trade, US President Donald Trump announced an increase in tariffs on imported steel and aluminium from 25%, doubling to 50%. The president stated this measure aims to further protect the domestic steel industry and preserve American jobs. The tariff increase is set to take effect on June the 4th and has already resulted in a rise in steel manufacturers' stocks. In other developments, the US-China trade truce is under threat. According to the Wall Street Journal, China has been delaying the export of rare earth elements despite a previous agreement to resume shipments. US officials have accused China of non-compliance, raising concerns of a deterioration in trade relations. Also, President Trump indicated that Japan is interested in negotiating a trade agreement with the United States. Talks between the two nations are ongoing, with expectations of finalising an agreement soon. Staying with North America, the US Supreme Court has ruled in favour of the Trump administration's immigration policy, allowing the government to revoke temporary protections for hundreds of thousands of migrants. The decision affects an estimated 532,000 individuals from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua and Venezuela who entered the United States under a 2-year humanitarian parole program established by former President Joe Biden. The ruling represents a significant legal victory for US President Donald Trump. It is the second time the Supreme Court has backed his immigration initiatives, which have faced numerous legal challenges. The parole program had allowed up to 30,000 migrants per month to enter the US temporarily from the 4 countries, all of which have been criticised for human rights violations. Earlier this month, the court also cleared the way for the deportation of around 350,000 Venezuelans. The current case stems from a decision by Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem to end an 18-month extension of temporary protected status for the migrants. A 30-day notice had been issued for those impacted to depart the US unless they qualify for other legal protections. Well, that is all we have time for, but we will continue to bring you more of the latest breaking news from across the world.